Hello and welcome to the latest installment in our UXDX online series. I hope you're as excited as I am for the lineup that we have tonight and the amazing talks that we're about to listen to. But before we jump into that, I want to give a very quick introduction to UXDX and why we host these sessions. So at UXDX, our mission is to help companies shift from building software using waterfall projects or water scrumfall, as a lot of companies out there use, to empowered autonomous product teams. And the reason why that's our mission is because when you're working in a high change environment that most of us are working in these days, where you're constantly moving, or you kind of maybe have 100 different projects depending on the size of your company. But I've worked in companies where there's 100 different projects on at any given time. So instead of the old days where you build a team, dismantle it, move it somewhere else, there's constantly something being changed on pretty much all parts of your product. And in that case, it makes sense to have a team that really understand the customer, really understand the business needs for that part of your product, so they can just keep iterating and making the product better for the customers and the business. Now, that's really easy to say. Oh, we'll just swap from waterfall to product teams, but that changes everything from business case processes to all of the supporting teams around it, not just even the teams themselves. So that's where the talks come in. So we ask people to come and share how they're changing their little bits or ways of working, or what new techniques they're adopting and how they're kind of shifting to this more modern way of working. Now, hopefully, as the talks are going on, you'll come up with some questions. And we would love you to share your questions with the speakers, because that means you're trying to think, how can you apply this in your context? And the speakers would be more than happy to answer those questions. We'll leave a little bit of time at the end of the talk. But sometimes we get too many questions and we can't answer them all in the time that we have. And that's why we have the UXDX community Slack group. So any questions that we don't have time to answer today, we'll post those in the Ask the Speakers channel, and we'll invite the speakers to come and answer those questions there. But that's enough about me. You didn't come here to listen to me talk. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the evening. So Chris O'Brien, who is the design principal at ExxonMobil, will be talking about architects, the original experienced designers. So I would like to welcome Chris to the stage. Hi, Chris.
Hi, how are you? Thanks so much for inviting me to talk about this. This is something that kind of came out of my weekend thinking, and the more I explored, the more I really got into it. And so I thought it'd be something great to share with everybody today. So I won't spend too much time on my introduction. I think you did a great job. I'm Chris O'Brien. I'm a design principal at ExxonMobil. And I really did just kind of want to share why I think that architects are the original experienced designers. So I started my design career working in environmental graphic design. So we designed environments for retail stores and car dealers, museums, hospitals, just to name a few. And the people I worked with were, as you can see, incredibly creative, but they often had a degree or were in school for architecture, or they had some kind of architectural background. And this is where my interest was first piqued in learning more about architecture and what goes along with it. And so it was after that I started to notice architecture in movies, right? And how it helped tell the story, how architecture was used to show scale or establish a hierarchy, how it communicated different messages like loneliness or brutality. And then I would read about all the different incredible architecture from around the world. And I was even lucky enough to have an opportunity to visit some of these locations. But it was in looking closer at domestic architecture that I started to think about the homes and the people that lived in them. And I began thinking about the architects that designed those homes. And that's when I had my aha moment. I bet that architects were the original user experience designers. You see, they think about people who will be living in these homes. They talk to them about what they want in a home, and then they go about meeting those needs in different ways. They think about the experience of a space, how a person moves through it, what utility it serves, and how aesthetics play a part in it. And so then I went down a rabbit hole, and I'm going to take you with me for a little bit, so just be patient. But imagine with me the evolution of home design. In the beginning, it was simply a hut, right? It provided shelter. It was a purely functional dwelling. It was all about utility. But now you look at the modern home and it's grown into multiple rooms, each serving their own purpose, sleeping, cooking, bathing, and each being designed to meet the needs of the individuals living in it. The modern architect works with their clients to identify their needs and problems that need solving. Then the architect designs the home, defining the spaces and their utility. For example, a living room might be where the family can gather, but is the focal point a fireplace? Is it a media center? Or is it a scenic view of the woods outside? These are all questions that can only be answered by the people using the space. The space is created with the users in mind. The space is to be experienced and interacted with. And so how does this correlate with UX? Well, quite simply, architecture delivers a physical object while UX delivers a digital product. Now, I know UX can deliver much more than just a digital product, but for the sake of this session, I'm going to focus on digital products. And so now let's look at the evolution of the computer. In the beginning, it was simply a command line interface, purely a functional way of interfacing with a computer. Type a command, said command executes. But now look at where we are. The graphical user interface was created, and the rest is history. Now, modern software and applications have grown into working on multiple devices and interfaces, all serving their own purpose. Apps for fitness, for groceries, for banking, for our cars, even for dating. And each being designed to meet the needs of the individuals using it. Just like architecture, it's all about the people using the software. So after seeing these similarities, I wanted to see if there were any more. Specifically, I wanted to see about the architect's process and compare it to the UX process. So as many of you probably already know, the UX process is made up half of research, half of design. And then those are further divided into what we like to call the 4 Ds: discover, define, design, and deliver. I find this double diamond to be a helpful way of thinking of the UX process. And what I uncovered was that architects share a very similar process. There are similarities that are worth calling out and some additional things that I think we can learn from them and add to our own process. And so we start with the discover phase. And they have a very similar discover phase to ourselves. They begin with meeting with the client. The meeting isn't just about gathering a list of things the client wants. It's about hearing what they like and don't like. It's about hearing their thoughts about the environment and the ideas that they have. How do they see the space being used? They often walk the site where they want to build, with the client giving impressions and ideas. This isn't something that can just be done over the phone. And in the UX world, we do the same with our clients. We often have 2 clients, right? The stakeholders and then those who will be actually using our products. And so we have to meet with our stakeholders to hear about what they want, but we also meet with the people who will be using our products. We want to hear about what they want. What are their goals and their needs? What problems do they need our products to help solve? Our job is to find where the user's needs and the business needs overlap. And we have different methods for this. We do stakeholder interviews and stakeholder mapping. There's field observations, ethnographic studies. We build scenarios and empathy maps. These are all methods that we use. Then the architect moves into doing what's called a site analysis. This is the process of evaluating a particular location's physical and social characteristics. During the site analysis, they're looking at the location, neighboring buildings, structures. They're looking at access points, restrictions, and hazards. There are a lot of things to consider before you start to design, and this is true in the UX world as well. We have just as much to consider with a digital product. Where will people be using this product? Now, where I work, we think about, is it at a gas pump? Is it in a refinery? Is it up on a scaffolding? Is it behind a desk? Is it indoor? Is it outdoor? What are they using? When are they using it? Is it at night, day? Is it a high stress situation? Is there high distractions? And what technology do they have access to? Is there a smartphone, low bandwidth, desktop only, no Wi-Fi? What limitations are they dealing with, both physical and digital? And it's after the discovery stage that the architect then moves into the define phase. And they start with what they call the big idea. It's called partie. Partie signifies the architect's overall guiding idea for the design. It's fuzzy in the beginning, and it's meant to be. Partie typically has less to do with technical, financial, and utilitarian issues and more to do with view or massing, scale, transparency, opaqueness, and other architectural issues. Now, I could spend a good portion of this just talking about partie. It can be hard to grasp, but I think I have some examples that might help give us a better understanding of what exactly what partie is. And the example that I find to be helpful is the concept of making your kitchen match the greenery outside. It can be about the surroundings and how they interact with the building, or how the structure itself interacts or elevates above its surroundings. It could be like Falling Water. Falling Water is a famous house designed by the architect Frank Lloyd Wright in rural southwestern Pennsylvania. It's a well integrated into the environment and appears to be built into a small waterfall. Its partie can be described by the well-known Frank Lloyd Wright quote, "No house should ever be on a hill or on anything. It should be of the hill, belonging to it." And so what does partie look like in product design? Well, it can be an integrated product, maybe across multiple technologies. Or maybe it's a baking website that looks so good you want to eat it. It could be a specific illustration style, or maybe it's new wearable technology. But partie is that guiding idea in the beginning for the design that then needs further fleshing out in what's called the design concept. The design concept is where the overall design begins to come more into focus. A strong architecture concept gives the architect a clear direction and framework when making design decisions. It provides a methodology to the thinking process by offering a type of rule book. And the concept is not just the structure, not just the building itself. It's the landscape around it. It's the colors, the styles, fixtures, finishes, the materials that will be used. And in the UX, design concept is very similar. All the work that's been done up to this point come together and informs the work going forward. This is where the research from the first diamond starts to merge with that second diamond. And we start to design. And what I like about this part of the architect's process is that it relies on two of my favorite things. That's learning and doing. The architect relies on their knowledge to guide the craft of doing and making. It's what the Greeks call episteme and techne. These are the fancy words that you get to take away from today's session. Well, these and partie. But architects are always reading and learning about the materials they're working with. They study people and how they interact with each other and how they interact with their environments. And so do we. As a designer, I love learning about new mental models and interaction patterns. And while I believe designers do not necessarily need to know how to code, there's a big discussion around this, I won't get into it, but I do believe they need to know about the code itself. Just as an architect needs to know about the different materials she'll be working with, wood, steel, concrete, so does the UX professional need to know about APIs, Angular, React, and the myriad of other technologies that are out there. And again, knowing about the people and how they interact with products and their surroundings. It's not a coincidence that quite a few UX professionals come from an anthropology background. Architects also start with sketching. I love this part of the process. And as you can see, there's all kinds of levels of fidelity. Sometimes it's just a scribble to get the idea out of the head and onto paper. while others are more precise, communicating more about the final design. And the same is true for the UX process, or at least I think it should be. I know in our modern times, we're able to jump right into Figma or Adobe XD, but there's something to be said about starting with pen and paper. I like sketching because I'm a firm believer that the fidelity of your design should match the fidelity of your thought. Don't jump right into a detailed design. Give yourself time to experiment with different styles and different approaches. I think this quote says it quite well from Eric Reinhold of 30 by 40 Design Workshop. Architectural design is iterative. Everything you do builds on your previous work as you develop a deeper understanding of the issues affecting the design. You'll start rough, refine, retool, rework. And that's when you see them moving into architectural models. This is a new level of detailed design. And as someone who has trouble putting together IKEA furniture, I'm amazed at the talent and skill that goes into these models. And it makes perfect sense on why they do it. There's no other way to see their design before it's built. Even in 3D software, one struggles to feel how the design is. And the same applies to prototypes in UX. They are quick and easy ways to learn about our designs. They provide a way for us to see how people interact and use what we're designing. They also provide a way for us to see our work. I can tell you that there's been a few occasions when I've been working on a design on the computer that I thought was great, but then when I used it on the phone, realized that it wasn't going to work. And as you can see, prototypes come in all shapes and sizes. Just because it's a digital product, it doesn't mean it has to be a digital prototype. And then we move into the deliver phase. Hearing about how architects and engineers work together, I was happy to see that it wasn't much different than how designers work with developers. It's a yin and yang relationship. Sure, there's times when we butt heads, but it isn't out of anger. Well, not most of the time, but out of what is best for the product. Just like with architecture, we need to engage with the engineers early and often to ensure that what we are designing is structurally sound. And while diagrams and floor plans are handy from a design perspective, you need technical drawings to build from. We've all seen at one point in our lives that classic blueprint drawing, right? And just as there's blueprints to build from, there are design specs to develop from. These cut down on misunderstandings and time wasted from back and forth and how the design should look and work. Now, these days, design specs are automated through plugins and different software. But there was a time when this was a manual exercise for every design a designer worked on. It was tedious work, I can tell you that much. But it was better than there being no specs at all. And the developer was left guessing, what's the distance between the form fields and the buttons and the labels? And so as we've seen, the design process for an architect and a UX professional aren't that different. And there's a lot to be learned from digging in deeper into the work that each does. And so to wrap up, I want to share a quote with you from, well, you guessed it, it's an architect. You employ stone, wood, and concrete, and with these materials, you build houses and palaces. That is construction. Ingenuity is at work. But suddenly you touch my heart. You do me good. I am happy, and I say, this is beautiful. That is architecture. Now, this may sound a little fuzzy or a bit esoteric, but I think it's important to stop and ask ourselves, how do we think about design? Oftentimes, I encounter people who are simply thinking about the construction of the software or an app. What technology can I use? What kind of features can I include? How fast can I get this done? And how can I avoid spending more money than I have to? And if we are to just focus on these things, then we will merely be constructing products. So let's think about the difference between construction and architecture. It's rather easy to simply construct a building where people will go to work every day, sitting in their cubicle maze. Where I work, shown on the right of this slide, this is our campus in Houston. and it's quite different from the standard office building you see on the left. You see, the campus was created with people in mind. It was created for chance encounters and spontaneous interactions. It was designed so that innovation and collaboration can occur. This was the partie, the big idea. And to achieve this, there was a process that was followed and a craft involved that elevates it above just construction. It goes beyond just a place where people go to work, more than just an office. The same is true for the products we are creating. They are more than just products that we construct to make the company money. They are products that improve the lives of our employees and of our customers. Uncovering these needs and designing the products that meet these needs requires a process, requires a craft and a skill. And this is how we elevate our products beyond simply being constructed. We elevate them to being products that solve problems, that improve lives, and that bring delight. So thank you for listening. I have a couple references for those of you who are interested in maybe learning more about architecture. And I'm happy also to answer any questions you might have now.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Chris. That was really interesting kind of analogy or syncing of the two. But the thing that came to my mind, I love those TV shows where they've got the architect transforming a house. And what I always take from it is architects don't care about your budget. They are going to do it. So
yeah, it's true. It's true. And, I'd love to live in that world, but we all have those constraints.
yeah, no, hopefully it's not advocating for that aspect of architecture. But as Chris did say, please do send in any questions that you have, be it on UXDX or YouTube, LinkedIn, whichever platform that you're watching this on, and we will put those questions through to Chris. I have a question, though, to get started, and it's something that I'm seeing a lot more, that as we move away from, let's say, the big project and the big plan up front to where we're doing much smaller, quick, iterative releases, is there a time for partie? Or do you are you constantly just kind of iterating on, if we were to take an analogy of a building, are you just building wall by wall, door by door, window by window, and not really getting the ability to step back and look at it in its environment?
Yeah, I recognize the aspirational nature of partie, and it's something that I wish I could say that I'm doing on a daily basis or even on a project basis. But it is true, as we move into working on all different types of applications, that we don't really have that opportunity. But I think still in a small scale, we can still try to apply some of that, even if it wasn't created at the beginning of the project. Is there some small way that we can apply it, whether it be the little features that we're trying to add to it that are already in the backlog, or maybe we're out trying to discover what other needs our customers have, and how to add that. But it is a I think that's one of those, every so often you'll land on a project like that where you get to have this big idea at the beginning. But I also recognize too that on a day-to-day basis it is hard to come by.
And is there any, because from my experience, I land a lot more on the existing legacy product and that we're just moving forward with, rather than the greenfields. Is there anything that you would recommend that somebody would do how do you try to take that step back and examine, so yes, you've got your legacy, you've got what's already there, but how do you move forward?
I think it's never too late to come up with a vision, right? I think a lot of products really do lack that, lack like a vision statement, right? So what is the UX vision? I think that's always a good thing to have a project team rally around. And then from that kind of helps guide. That's your North Star that you're able to design around. And I think it helps too, even from a project standpoint, right? Because, from a business standpoint, it might be all just, kind of financials and customers and, how do we get more? And it's just very, numbers driven. And then from a development standpoint, maybe it's, for them, it's just kind of getting in there, grinding out the code, getting it to work, right? And so to have this vision that a team can kind of rally around, I think that has such a positive impact on the work that we do. And I think that's a fantastic way to really start to add some of this that kind of gets that falls to the side often.
Makes sense. No, I fully agree. I love the concept of a vision that people can aim towards. I think it's really empowering and inspiring.
Yeah.
How does somebody, so your quote that you kind of finished on, where anybody can build a building, but I can't remember, I'm paraphrasing now,
Yeah.
there's a difference between good architecture. How do you
Yeah.
get skill set? How do you go from kind of just being, as you're starting your career maybe, or what are the things that
Yeah.
you should be doing to become that next level?
Yeah, I think that's a part of, start. I think back to my own career, and that really was in the beginning. I was just trying to get things to work. I was just trying to make sure that the functional piece was there, and then you start to better understand who you're designing for, and I think that's a critical piece is really getting out of our own head and better learning about the people that we're designing for. It's from there that you're able to kind of stretch beyond, just your own interest or the interests of others too, and always staying in touch with what's going on out in the industry. I find to steal from Austin Kleon, we want to steal like an artist, right? And so always looking for that kind of inspiration to see what other people are doing, because you do reach a point where I think to use kind of this construction analogy of you've been constructing things, right? And there's a true craft there, right? So in the quote, he says, ingenuity is at work, right? And so it's a very positive thing. But then to take it that step further, right? After that, after you become comfortable with the construction of the piece, after you become comfortable with the technologies that you're using or who you're designing for, right? As you learn more, and I think that goes back to kind of that episteme and techne, right? Those two go hand in hand, and you can't just have one or the other. They really build off of each other, and I feel like they kind of, as you get better at one, you realize you've fallen behind a little bit on the other, and so it's this constant kind of back and forth between the two. But like most things, it's really time. It's time and how you spend it.
Excellent. It's going to bring me, I think we've time for just one last question, and I guess it's future gazing, so we don't know the answer.
Yeah.
But for me, because when you mentioned designers don't need to code, I'm thinking about how advanced level 1 of Copilot and Ghostwriter and those kind of code writing AIs are.
Yeah.
Like, they're pretty powerful now. So level 2 or 3 is going to be very powerful. But
Yes.
where do you, if you take away, so the equivalent that I've seen from a design perspective is where you can give a prompt and it will lay out kind of pages for you. So
Sure.
if we move away, like you said, from redlining, doing it manually, to the systems automatically doing it, and they're going to take
Yeah.
over a little bit more of what we do, how
Right.
do you think people are going to get to that level if you're taking away the kind of the lower level pieces that they're doing?
Yeah, yeah, that's the big conversation right now is AI taking over everything, I think it's a tool like everything else, right? I think it's going to be to our advantage at first. It might be a little threatening, but I think there's more to it out there, right? And it's there's some things that can be easily laid out and have it do that work for you, but it frees you up, right? It frees you up to those bigger challenges. And that's one thing, at least from my standpoint, a lot of the times we get pulled in from people who think we just do interface work, right? And so our complaint is, well, we haven't had time to do this upfront work, right? So that's what I'm always saying, is that research informs the design, right? So it's one thing to plug something in and say, hey, I need a login screen into AI, right? But it's what's that work up front, right? So the login screen, that's a small piece in what we do, right? And it's near the end of our process, but it's that beginning, that understanding that we're trying to do. That I see that as something that's going to free us up to do more of that work.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I agree. AIs can spit out what's existing, but they don't know what's new. At
Right.
this current generation, at least.
Yes. Yeah.
That brings us to time. So thank you very much, Chris, for sharing. I really enjoyed that, and I hope everybody out there did as well.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This was great.
Excellent. So up next, we have Bhakti Patel, who's a senior staff product designer, who'll be talking about motion design help wanted. So I'd like to welcome Bhakti to the stage. Hello, Bhakti.
Hi, nice to meet everyone. I appreciate everyone joining and want to thank UXDX for having me. So I wanted to chat to you guys about specifically motion and products. So why motion? How do you get started? How to approach it as a company or a team or an individual, and what it can actually do for your career. A little bit of background, a little bit about me. I come from a motion design background, not a product background. So for years, I freelanced and contracted at agencies and studios and have worked with all these companies and brands. Most notably, I animated the UI in the movie Black Panther and in Thor Ragnarok. Not real UI, but their fake spaceship, futuristic kind of UI. And that was actually my first time animating UI in general. So in general, though, I would animate in my freelance work for the brand, not exactly the product. But that all started to change when I started going full-time at all of these places. But specifically at Dropbox and Twitter, I served as the motion design lead. And because I'm slightly afraid of the current owner of Twitter, I'm only going to show you guys work from Dropbox, and we'll just pretend the other one isn't there for now. But why motion? So why is it so important to have it in product or start to develop a skill and bring it to your team and your company? Well, the reality is motion is absolutely necessary. It shouldn't be an afterthought in product. But unfortunately, unless you're doing a complete rebrand, it often is an afterthought. It's a tool just like color and type and buttons and modals. It's part of the design system and it's all encompassing. A decision around motion is needed for everything because motion added to anything can completely and entirely change the meaning or intent of the design. It can change the perception of loading by making things feel faster. It can help orient you in a product. It can, like it's shown to increase engagement and interactivity. It can change the perception of a brand by making it feel a lot more modern. So it's a useful tool that isn't just for fun. And I do want to be clear, when I'm talking about motion, this type of motion is never okay. When you do this kind of motion product, it ruins it for everyone. And the funny thing is, when I did that fireworks animation, I realized I actually have done a firework animation in product, but this is probably the only circumstance where it could be okay. And that's because I had a really good reason for it, which was after you check off an entire list of, like your to-do, that you have this little feel-good kind of moment in product. So it was like an emotional way to use it. But that might be the only time you can ever use fireworks in animation for a product. So getting started, what does it mean? Like, what's your role in motion when it comes to the product? So chances are you're probably not a motion designer, and that's completely okay. But if you want to push for motion design at your place or pick it up as a skill, you need to understand what your role might look like or the best way that you can work with a motion designer. So what that means is if you're in design systems or product, then you might be the key decision maker or the driver for that work. If you're in engineering, it means that you're generally the bottleneck, but we'll get into a little bit more about how you can make sure that motion can help push forward through engineering. Then there's research and accessibility. So these guys should be constantly consulted on whether or not what they're creating or what's being animated works for the users. Or if you're on the motion and brand team, this is a little bit tricky. So we'll get into it in a second. But if you're in design systems and product, your questions on the team or the problems you're trying to solve is, where does motion live? How does it work as a system? What problems can it solve? And how do you get started? You guys are generally a driver for all that work. Engineers are looking at what tools can be implemented, what's the end cost, as in, if you add in an animation here, is it going to slow down the product in any way? That's a question that engineers will need to answer. And then how do you tokenize it or document it? And this is generally a collaboration with design systems and product, as well as the motion designer. And then there's research and accessibility. So what benefit does motion have to the customers itself? And how do you make it widely accessible? Motion around accessibility isn't talked enough, and that's because the research isn't really there. So this is something that I'm hoping that as people get more and more into motion, that it gets pushed to have more accessibility for motion research done. And then motion and brand team. So the reason why this is a little bit of a tricky one is that while it is the same medium of motion, the purpose is completely different. So how does product motion live and work with the rest of the brand motion? But where's that overlap? And then where do they actually break apart? And I think the most important thing is that motion has to have a purpose in product. It cannot be for fun. It cannot be just for the sake of like the brand. It has to have some sort of purpose. So I think that's really, really key and something that shouldn't get overlooked. And that's where I think that collaboration might be a little tricky. You don't want to get too much collaboration from brand on these things, but you still do need it. So where do you start? If you were to try to bring motion into your product, into your team, what's the best place to start? An audit. And I don't mean the IRS kind, but the going through every user flow of the product and understanding how a user moves through your app. So thinking about like those key touch points. So where does motion already exist? What tools and teams are currently working with it? What areas can motion be used to solve a problem? Can motion be approached as a whole through design systems? So what really is that best place to start? And if you really don't know, my general experience has shown that it tends to be onboarding. It's like a really good place to start because it's contained. Not everyone sees it. So if something breaks, it might be a little bit more okay to test there. The other thing as well is that it can be a little bit more expressive. So you can push the boundaries, how users are reacting to that as well. And it's really key to, it's a really like key place that every stakeholder wants to kind of push, which is more and more people to sign on, and motion does create more engagement and interactivity. So there is a good use case for it. So, all right, you figured it out. You understand like where you kind of could use motion, what problems it can solve. But what you need to do now is understand the customer as well. For instance, at Dropbox, the customer is very productivity driven. They just want to go through the product, find their project file, and get out of there as quickly as possible. So their main focus is really speed and orientation. So focus is to get through that product. In this like animation right there, you can see you're moving through it pretty quickly. When you click on something, it scales open. When you expand or collapse that sidebar, it has a very quick animation. If you use motion in a way to slow things down, every customer will rebel in this case. So that's not really the right way to approach motion for this customer base. The next thing you can do is start to do a lot of motion tests. So this is where you bring in a motion designer. And what they'll do is animate something hundreds of different ways. These motion tests you're seeing here is from Adventure, Willie and Jill, who worked with us on these motion tests. A shout out to them. But when I say 100 different ways, I do mean 100 different ways. Gunner was a studio that kind of animated this Dropbox logo, and they went every possible way that they could. And what's nice is it kind of forces you to rethink what the brand can really be, or what motion in the product can actually be, how expressive you can be, how quick and simple you really need to be. When everyone doesn't have a clear picture in their head, this is a really easy way to just get as much out there so you have something to discuss and talk about. The one key thing, though, that I try to recommend is that you always choreograph it. When you're doing your motion test, try as often as possible to animate the whole screen and not individual elements. A user never sees the button just on its own. They always see it in context. So animate it in context. And then after you start to do all these different motion tests, try to find patterns. What are the things that people are gravitating towards? What feels really good? And see if you can expand those principles out into other parts of your motion tests. Now, this is something that, while it's in this section, it is something that you need to do from the beginning, which is make friends with engineering. They really are going to be your best friends throughout this entire process because they'll keep you in check as to what could be too much, what's going to cost too much. For instance, on the left there, you could see a motion test that was something that I just thought like looked really cool. It felt really like clean and speedy, but it is really difficult to do, and the cost, it would just take too much end cost. And what we did was something on the right, which still has that same purposeful kind of motion where it has that like little bit of position change happening without being too heavy. So engineering's not really there to put a stop to things, while it might feel like that from time to time, but try to understand what the core problem is and work from there. If it's like an end cost, let's create something that's a little bit easier to do. If it's that component, just can't animate that way because the infrastructure is not built that way. Okay, so let's find a temporary solution and then work towards seeing what we can do in the long term that can actually allow some of this other motion to be implemented. The other thing as well is prototype it and put it through research. So after you get those motion tests, after you have a general idea of what you want to test, maybe try like the one that you're really looking forward to, and then a simpler version, and then something a little bit further out. Prototype it and then put it through research. And the key to this is honestly really trying to understand or decipher what the users really mean. For the previous motion, they said, I don't know what is different. I can't quite pinpoint it, but the second option just feels better. It felt better. The second option was the one with motion, the first without. And what that indicates to us is that motion doesn't have to be in your face to be appreciated. It can be felt, as minimal as it is. So keep that in mind when you're trying to implement motion into the product. You don't have to go that far out. It can really be as simple and purposeful as possible. And then once you're able to kind of understand that, refine it, expand it, and repeat it. Go through that user experience, user research process one more time and see what people are saying. And then lastly comes to the defining stage. And this is where you really, really need to work with your engineers, because sometimes they have a very specific way that they want this motion documented. I've seen so often where it doesn't ever get to the define stage. It kind of gets stuck at like, okay, here are all the motion tests. This is what we want in the product. And then it doesn't actually get built. And that's because of this particular process. So this is really key. Start early on, work with the engineers, figure out what that documentation might look like later on. So when you get to this stage, it's not a complete mystery. Sometimes there's certain things that can't be exactly defined. We're at that point exporting like a JSON file. And for that, you would use something like Lottie animations, which is a tool that you can use to create code-based animation that engineers can implement a lot easier. It's a lot lighter. Something that I recommend you guys looking into if you're really interested. Google Lottie animations. Airbnb developed it, but it's a tool that a lot of big companies are using these days. But once you're able to export it, then you have this nice little file that could replace any GIF. This is perfect for illustrations, icons, and logo animations. For the rest, I would highly recommend just building it or writing it out in code. And the one big thing is throughout this entire process, you're going to hit roadblocks everywhere you go. And honestly, just keep swimming. When you're trying to get motion in for modals or for the snack bar, sometimes that might get delayed. Go back and start, doing motion tests and animations on a different part of the product. And slowly just kind of keep everything moving. Don't just wait and get stuck somewhere. Just try something else, start animating somewhere else, and slowly it'll start to progress over time. So that's the general process. But when it comes to all of this, there's been a couple of thoughts from my experience at both of these companies and as the motion design lead and working on motion at the other tech companies as well. But the biggest things, the first lessons I've learned are really on team collaboration. The first thing is just make it easy to work with motion. This is really a note to the motion designers who are on your team. Create just like really simple toolkits. Start here, how to customize, export, super simple things to make it as easy as possible anyone to dive in. The second is get buy-in from engineering early on. Motion needs to be implemented on a system level. It's not easy for them to do that. And to think that, they can just take a piece of code and plug it in and it's all good and it works is not really how that happens. On top of that, they often have a lot of pressure to prioritize other projects or other needs that are a little bit more like it could break the system kind of thing if they don't get to it right now. So you really need to sell the purpose of motion and what it can really do, which is like drive user engagement and create a much better experience by having motion in the product. So make sure they're your partners in the process and have that buy-in, make it a relationship early on. And the third is just keep people informed. Like I mentioned, motion is a huge undertaking. It is throughout the entire product. It is in, like I mentioned, modals and snack bars and the onboarding and buttons and icons, illustrations. It's everywhere that can be in the product. So you can't do it alone. Make sure that everyone is along with you on that process. The 3 lessons I kind of learned on what it means to make meaningful animation. This is really key that every motion needs a purpose. Google uses 3 principles, which is that it has to be informative, focused, or expressive. Every company kind of has a different way of going about it, but it generally tends to fall under these 3. At Dropbox, I kind of focus a little bit more on structural motion, so things that are a little bit more or like orienting you in the space. The second being interactive motion, so the smaller things like that feel a little bit more reactive, like clicking on a button and what would happen then. Informative, which is just something to draw your attention to when an alert comes up or a notification bell kind of ringing. And the fourth was the expressive kind of emotional motion, which is at very, very specific and seldom times where you really want the brand to actually show through. So every motion just needs a purpose in general. There's so many different ways that you can kind of figure that out, but really focus on what works for you and your brand. The second lesson I kind of learned was that try to stay problem solution focused, understand the problem. And it's so easy when you're working on motion and coming through this that you're like, okay, here's a problem. Motion can be the solution. But the question you have to ask is it actually the right solution? Sometimes motion could be a way to solve it, but it might not be the best if you just need to redesign it, right? So keep that in mind. Ask these questions of the right solution, not just a solution. And the third thing is that accessibility matters. Motion should be somewhat accessible. For what isn't, you should have a reduced motion setting. So that's just something to keep in mind. Always think about accessibility as you're going through this entire process. Some of the things that I really learned when I first started getting into product for motion, like I mentioned, I came from a kind of brand motion background, which was really quite different. So the first thing I really did was just study. I studied Google Material, IBM Carbon, Uber, Compass, like all those different motion guidelines and toolkits that were out there, and tried to really understand it, how they went about it, how I would do it differently, what if I were to apply it to a completely different brand? How would I take that? And just really, really study. There's hundreds and hundreds of Medium articles out there that can give you the resources and information on why this is really important. And I highly recommend using that as a place to start. Think holistically. So start with a defined space or a defined component, onboarding or the startup screen, something that's a little bit more defined. And then that way you can actually think about how it can build out into something larger. But the last thing you want to do is only define how something moves, like a button in just settings, but then not about how it would work everywhere else. So think about confined areas so that way you can approach it on a larger scale. And then lastly, don't reinvent the wheel. Again, I'm coming from a motion background, so it's a little bit easier for me to start to think about like implementing all of this motion and do all these motion tests, but it's not necessary to get started. There are out-of-the-box motion, which is motion that's OS specific. For instance, like Android and iOS have their own motion tokens that engineers can implement a lot more easily. So that was a route that we ended up taking at a couple of different clients as well. So that's something to consider. And then on implementation, understand tools like Lottie. As I mentioned, it's a really great way to get illustrations or icons or logos animated without using a GIF. It's a JSON file. Engineers are more familiar with this, and it keeps things light and kind of saves you a lot of time on trying to figure out how to reduce the eng cost. The second thing is always just keep testing, work closely with engineering to understand the metrics, and keep refining motion as you go. And then lastly, remember that it takes time. Implementing is something that doesn't happen immediately. It's not that quick, and it can take over a year. So be patient and stay informed throughout the entire process. And then the last thing I kind of want to leave you guys with is 3 of my thoughts on what it means to have a career where you add some of that motion UX to it. So the first is that motion will eventually become a requirement. You don't need to be an expert in it. You just need to know enough on how to work with it. So pick up a few different skills, start in Figma, move forward, but eventually it will be required. Right now, though, it's still an opportunity, which means that it's a way for you to stand out. So getting motion early in your career, starting to think about that right now, can make a huge difference later down the line. The second thing is always just start small. I know it's a huge, new skill. Animation is quite daunting, but you don't need to learn and animate in After Effects. Leave that for another time. Just start with some basic motion in Figma or Protopie. And the third is it will grow. And what I mean by that is motion and product is still, while it is at the bigger companies, you are seeing it a lot more. It's still quite in its infant stages. Maybe at this point a little bit at the toddler level, but in general, prototyping with motion in Figma kind of sucks. Research for motion accessibility is very limited right now, but these are opportunities to contribute to that growth. If you're, noticing that prototyping in Figma is that bad, start to build tools for it if you can. Research for motion accessibility is limited right now. Be the person or that person in that company that creates that research for motion accessibility. Try to see these as opportunities for your career to really, really expand, to have a place to really own. So that's kind of what I really do truly believe are the opportunities here when it comes to your career, when it comes to your company and everything else. So in general, wanted to leave you guys with some time for questions, but thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. That was a really great graphics and demonstration. So I really love the examples of the different motion. I was definitely picking the ones that I thought were my favorite as well when I was looking at your examples. So thanks for sharing that. So yeah, as Bhakti said, she's open for questions. So please do write in any questions that you have. Oh, and we have one straight here from Chris. I would be interested in hearing if you have ever run into pushback on the time/money it takes to design motion into a product, and if so, some tips on how to get buy-in.
I have ran into that everywhere. And the thing is, no matter how far along in the process you are, that problem will still continue to keep coming up. And that's why, like, I always mention try to get engineering bought in early. And I say that from a little bit of experience, and by that, a lot of experience, that's always a bit of a struggle, just trying to get more people's time. Money is often not as much of an issue. It's really time and getting like the resources from everyone. It takes, as I mentioned, an entire team to get everyone on board. Some of the biggest ways that I went about it was one, when we ran into the issue with, for instance, engineering saying that, implementing Lottie would be really difficult. It's a huge task and stuff like that. What I asked for was, can I get an engineer's time for just 2 days? If I can just get 2 days with them to do a really quick test, then, if nothing comes of it, then, we can revisit it, but let's see what we can do in 2 days. And within 2 days, we were able to really quickly test it. All the resources were there. And we were able to document the entire process of what it would take. And we realized it's actually really easy. So we had, something to actually go back to them with and say, actually, it is possible. This is why we believe it's possible and why it doesn't take as much time. So that was a really quick way. It's just asking for a little to see how much further you can take it. The second thing was, it's really hard with motion in particular because people do think it is something for fun, and it's just an additive. But it's not icing on the cake. It's literally part of the batter. It's like the sugar in it. And cake without sugar is just gross, right? So it is something that is absolutely necessary. And to kind of sell that, you need that user research. So that's where you need to bring in customers or talk to a UX research team from the very beginning. And you need to start to look into how this actually solves a problem. Be very, very clear and defined as to what you can provide. And if you don't try to sell it as oh, let's just, add something to the toolkit or to the system, this is something that can really, make it cool and fun and change the brand perspective, that won't get you as far as saying that this is going to help get users to interact and engage with the product more, which is completely and entirely true. And that is the real purpose of motion in the product. That this is going to help orient users in the product. Something that's really, really annoying is when you click out of something and you don't know where it went, or you open something and you forget where it opened out of and things like that. But a little bit of motion, just that little bit of scale or scaling down when you close something, makes all the difference, right? Or when something pops up, just that little bit of scale up and then everything else falling into depth. Yeah, exactly. And that bit of motion can help you get oriented in the space a lot faster. It changes that little tiny moment of confusion in the customer's mind into something that's really quick and something that they understand. So motion is insanely purposeful, and lead with that whenever you're going forward.
Excellent. No, it's a great one, because that was actually going to be my first question as well, because I know some people who are they're struggling to get designers on teams, let alone the extra kind of
I know the struggle.
Yeah. One thing, I loved your analogy of informative focus, because what really bugs me is when I get to a website and it's trying to it puts motion in as I'm scrolling. And then if I'm scrolling quickly, things haven't arrived because they're doing this kind of reveal thing. And that just bugs me. So what would you kind of say to people who just kind of, I guess, grab those templates, or they just start sliding motion in everywhere?
Yeah. I would honestly start from zero. Show the entire page with zero motion and then see where it's absolutely necessary and start to think about it. So for instance, with the when you're in the Dropbox product, you don't want all your files loading one by one. That's going to drive anybody crazy, right? But maybe when you're on the marketing page where you want a little bit more of that pizzazz and that kind of stardom, that you might actually let that happen. But again, it shouldn't ever be to a degree that it actually hinders you from using the product or using that website. So that's something to really keep in mind. But yeah, I think the best thing you can do is just start from scratch, have a clear no motion template, and then kind of build from there.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks very much. That actually brings us to time. So I just want to thank you again for sharing your insights on motion design.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
Excellent. So that actually brings us to the end of the event for this evening. But if you did like those talks and like the kind of the concept of bringing product UX design and developers together, and as Bhakti said, get UX design and dev together up front to get buy-in for making these improvements. And we run a conference, our next one's coming up in New York in May. And the idea is if we get everybody together to learn together and learn exactly how each other work, then we'll be in a better place to actually build and make products together as well. So we'll have 25 speakers, there'll be 500 people that you can meet your peers, we'll have 8 workshops, so please do consider joining us at that. But if not, I look forward to seeing you at the next UXDX online session, and thank you for joining.